Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We will start in a few seconds. We're just waiting for a couple of people to join, and we will kick off. Okay, I think let's start. We're going to try to keep the conversation tight and engaging, and we hope we'll also have an opportunity for some questions from the online audience. So good afternoon from Johannesburg. This is a completely international webinar. I'd like to welcome Professor Harsh Pant, who's joining us from India. So it's a little later in the afternoon there. In the middle, pretty much like South Africa, Dr. Matteo Via from joining us from Italy in ISPI in Milan, but I'll introduce you all properly. And then early this morning, also celebrating Brazilian National Day today. So a very big thank you for joining us this afternoon, Dr. Fabio Soares from IPA. So welcome to all of you as well, from wherever you may be joining us. We're very glad to have you here to hear a little bit about and to discuss a little bit what the expectations from the Delhi G20 Summit might be. For all of those who may not know me, I'm Elizabeth Sideropoulos. I am the director at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and over the course of this last year, I've had really the honor and the pleasure of participating in the various meetings of the Indian T20, the Think 20 chairmanship, where a lot of the priorities and a lot of the discussions that we'll also see featuring in the G20 Summit have been very much the order of the day. And indeed, a month ago now, we had the Think 20 Summit, where we also published the Think 20 communique, as well as the communique of the various task forces that we were all participating in. But I'm sure that my colleague in India will also be able to reflect a little bit more on that. So we have the India, the summit coming up on the 9th and the 10th of September. I think it's certainly been India's significant I think engagement on many of these issues over the last year in a way that really has advanced a lot of the global South issues, and I think engaged on some of the critical dimensions of global public goods in that process. But of course, none of these forums at the moment are without difficulties, and so it will be useful today to hear from our panelists about what they expect to come out from it, as well as looking forward to the incoming presidency of Brazil on the 1st of December this year. And also we have with us the incoming presidency of the G7, which is Italy, taking over from Japan at the end of the year. And of course, South Africa here, South Africa will be succeeding Brazil at the end of 2024 as the G20 president. So let me then introduce my panel properly. Firstly, Professor Harsh Pant, who is the Vice President of Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation in India. The Observer Research Foundation was also the T20 Secretariat this year for the entire Think 20 process, and was part of the T20, the core group of the T20. And I hope that things have calmed down a little bit, Professor Punt, after the T20 Summit. But somehow I think you still have a few more events up your sleeve, up your sleeves. Dr. Fabio Suarez is the Director of International Studies at the Institute of Applied Economic Research in Brazil. IPEA, well-known itself, a well-known public research institution, is going to be one of the co-chairs of the Brazil Think 20, and already a lot of effort and thinking and engagement has gone into that process. And then last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mateo Villa from from ISPI, the International Institute. I always get it wrong, the Institute for International Political Studies, right? Sorry, it's getting the political studies right. He's a senior research fellow at ISPI. When Italy chaired the G20, ISPI was one of the co-chairs and the lead co-chair in the Think 20, and of course next year likely to, or is confirmed, will be the T7, the Think 7 co-chairs. So a panel that is very much involved in all of the G20 discussions over a number of years. Before I sort of start off with you, Professor Punt, just to also acknowledge the support and collaboration that we have built up with the National Institute for the Social Sciences and the Humanities here in South Africa, and the South African BRICS think tank, which is part of the NIHSS, and together also with IPEA, we're in the process of executing a project that looks at just climate transitions, a topic that is very important in the BRICS context, but also absolutely in the discussions around climate in the G20. So let me then begin with what you guys are all here to listen to, and that is really what to expect from the Delhi Summit. Professor Punt, let me start with you first. I think India has had a very ambitious G20 agenda. What have been the priorities, and what do you think will come out of those priorities in the summit in the next couple of days?
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for having me part of this conversation. And certainly, everyone here has been part of the T20 process that I think, in some ways, ORF as the G20 Secretariat was leading, and it was a very enriching experience, rewarding at times tough. But I think we are now nearing the end of the process, so we are we can be a bit more relaxed. Although it's as Elizabeth was suggesting, there are a few things still to be done till the formal handover. But I would I would start by just situating the kind of conversations, for example, that we are having right now in the broader context in which the evolution happened. So when we started off this process, it was very clear that there is a lot of despondency about the wider multilateral system in the world. And in particular, I think the developing world, the global south, was particularly disturbed because a lot of the concerns of the global south, of the developing countries, were not being reflected in the global governance agenda. Intense polarization in global politics, security competition increasing, multilateralism almost defunct. We were looking at various multilateral institutions not really taking the global governance agenda forward. And I think the brunt was being borne by some of the poorest, most vulnerable countries in the world, because their aspirations, their interests, no one was talking about. So in some ways, when the process started, the idea was that, look, can we change the nature of some of these conversations and bring to the center stage those conversations that at the end of the day, when G20 was conceived of, the idea was that, look, this is going to be about the developmental agenda, about geoeconomics, about bridging the divide between the developing and the developed world, because that's what G20 was. forum where extant powers and some of the more aspirational powers can together sit and talk about big ticket global governance items. And in that sense, that momentum was, I think, missing somewhere. And you would recall, even when the Bali summit happened and the Bali communique came out, all the focus was on how we could get a joint communique. Despite all the tensions and the geopolitical tensions, the geopolitical process somehow became the focal point of attention. I don't think we today remember the salient points of the Bali Declaration in terms of the developmental agenda that it set out for. We all remember that, oh wow, the Russians and the Chinese and the West could all agree on a joint communique. So I think in some ways the situation this time is different. And I think it's different partly because the fault lines have become sharper. So you see, for example, the Chinese president not being in Delhi, or the Russian president not being in Delhi in person for the summit. But I would say that the nature of the conversation that India tried to formalize over the last few months, that perhaps has become more interesting for a large part of the world that was not associated with the multilateral, agenda. So I think we have, when in January, for example, when India did the Voice of the Global South Summit, the idea was that when India goes and frames its own agenda, it also wants the Global South or the developing world's agenda to be part of that agenda. So keeping their agenda, whether it is SDGs, whether it is climate finance, whether it is a digital divide or sustainable and equitable development, all those issues on those issues should be centered the formal agenda that India would bring to the table. And to that extent, I would say that I think whether or not we get a joint communique at the end of the Delhi process, we would see a kind of a revived multilateral agenda where I would say that a lot of other stakeholders perhaps have joined the conversation this time than say in the past. And that to me, is kind of an achievement for a lot of the work that has gone into the last few months. That the process itself to me is something that perhaps has become important and has become more salient. Of course, global headlines will be about the outcomes and about the joint communique. But I think all of us who work in this space of think tanks and ideas, we would find a lot of ideas being propelled by the way India has positioned Global South as the anchor in this conversation. So let me end these initial remarks by laying out this very broad contours of where we were when we started and where we hope we will be when the process culminates this weekend.
Great. Thanks, Harsh. I think for our South African audience, it'd probably also be useful to reflect a little bit on a couple of the priorities. I think the point that one of the priorities was really about the process and the involvement of the Global South. And I think also the involvement of India as a whole, that was astonishing. I think really raising the profile, making the G20 a vehicle that is not, people don't understand and say, but why is it important to me? I think is also part of the conversation about moving forward on multilateralism. Perhaps reflect a little on that, because I think it's also useful for us as countries that are coming up in the G20 process to reflect on in terms of an all of society engagement. And then perhaps also reflect a little bit on some of the priorities. What I found fascinating in many of the discussions was really the digital public infrastructure discussion as one element of that. And the other one, of course, about the concept that the Prime Minister has put forward, which is the lifestyle for the environment, which also reflects the one Earth, one planet, one family. I think I've got it in the wrong order, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, for India, I was talking about the process unfolding over the last few months. I would say it has been, as you mentioned, it's been a two-way process. India reaching out to the world and trying to shape the global governance agenda in ways that perhaps helps not only India, but a large part of other stakeholders that India wants to bring together. But the other process has been about India having a conversation with itself. That what I mean, for a long time there have been questions about whether India wants to be a leader, whether India wants to lead, whether India has the will and the ability to shape global governance agenda. Is India still a country better at pointing out the problems rather than solutions? That those kind of conversations have been there within India, and there has been a lot of reticence even within India about how to project India on the global stage. I think one thing that you can safely say after this, after the end of this year-long exercise, is that I think in the policymakers, perhaps in India, have been successful in if you recall, Elizabeth, Dr. Jaishankar said at the G20 Summit, of taking India to the world and bringing the world to India. In some ways, that the fact that you really cannot today talk about a global India and at the same time not have a conversation on what your global priorities are going to be with as wide a set of stakeholders as possible. So whether it is the students, whether it is the youth, whether it is civil society, the businesses, the corporate sector, the whole gamut of stakeholders that we have seen engage in this exercise, and then through multiple lenses. I mean, one of the strongest aspects of India's presidency has been, and one of the issues on which India has emphasized a lot has been women-led development. So in a sense, gender became a very important lens through which India pursued its developmental aspirations on the global stage, or wants to do that, and therefore bringing in a lot of the gender debate at the center of the developmental debate as well. So I think in that exercise, I would say domestically, India has been very successful in terms of mobilizing public opinion, as you were saying. Look, what is this for? What is the purpose of G20, and why is it important for India? I think making a case to that effect has been, very useful exercise, for people like us who study and are students of international relations. Finding it a more broad-based exercise is always good. Having more people involved in this conversation rather than it being a very elite-centric, Delhi-based exercise. It became a pan-India exercise with multiple states involved. State governments themselves came out and said, even opposition. So it became I think one of the things that was very interesting was that for a while, at least, India kept the partisanship aside. There were opposition party-led governments who were doing G20 related events and who were participating in these conversations because they also felt that most of these conversations are ultimately about reaching to the last person at the end of the line. So how do we bridge this divide between foreign and domestic? And one of the things, and I think they found the G20 platform very useful. So I think in that sense, as you were mentioning, it has been a very useful exercise for India itself, trying to figure out what it wants to do on the global stage, and therefore also figuring out whether it wants to lead in a certain way, and perhaps different from what others articulate. So it trying to find its own voice on the global stage through this process has been very, very interesting. On the issues, I think where India perhaps has been most focused on, I would start by this whole idea of equitable development and sustainable globalization. We are living in an age where everyone is talking of deglobalization, de-risking, decoupling, whatever it is. And I think it's a very difficult time to make a case for globalization because most of the countries who at one point were the strongest votaries of globalization are now becoming more inward-looking. So in that sense, having to revive that dialogue in this atmosphere, saying that, look, yes, globalization and economic globalization may have had some negative aspects to it. The sort of distribution issues are important and we need to look at it. But how do you revive the confidence of a large part of the world that economic globalization is good, that ultimately it has benefited so many people around the world, including in India, that I think it would be foolhardy to take the process back or to rethink some of the assumptions. Perhaps we can structure it better. Perhaps we can make it more equitable and inclusive. And that exercise, I think, India wanted to put at the center of some of these conversations that happened. Then I think, this whole idea of what you mentioned in the context of climate change, India, you would recall, had been very diffident about some of the commitments, etc., for a very long time. India was seen as a naysayer. I think we have changed that argument in fundamental ways, and I think the Modi government, in some ways, in the last 10 years, has been able to radically shift the goalpost. So we had the 2017 net zero, for example, framework, and through which the argument is that, look, India, of course, there are issues around climate finance. There are issues around how do you make it more equitable for countries who are rising, who are developing, not to bear the brunt of this. But I think in the end, India also saying that, look, it is also our responsibility now as global stakeholders in this conversation. We cannot shun our responsibility. So I think sharpening that agenda, including through what you call, the lifestyle for environment, the sense that ultimately it is at the individual level. So states can make certain commitments, but unless individuals are making certain commitments, it becomes a very, very difficult exercise. And I think therefore linking the individual to the national to the global in this exercise has been an interesting framework through which to look at the climate change conversation, while at the same time continuing to look at the climate finance and adaptation issues through the lens which I think need to be looked at, because a large part of the developing world is still looking for that finance that has to come from the developed world. And I think the third factor has been, which you pointed out, the DPI, the digital public infrastructure. And that has been the part where I think India is telling its own story to the world. That, look, this is something that India has been able to do as a developing country, relatively poor country, a country with enormous inequalities. We have been able to bridge the digital divide at costs that are perhaps in a very cost-effective manner. And perhaps this is something that India can share with a large part of the global south, with the developing world, where the digital divide is very extreme, not only within societies, but across, when you look at the developed versus the developing framework. So I think in that sense, India becomes, by looking at its own experience, by bringing in its own experience to the table, it becomes a kind of bridge between these multiple stakeholders. So I would say that, cutting across the developmental agenda, the climate agenda, the gender agenda, and the digital agenda, we have seen these four pillars that have informed a lot of these conversations throughout the specifics of various tracks, ministerial tracks that have followed. And of course, there have been differences and challenges, but we'll come to that later. But I think the positive story, as of now, one can look at the more optimistic side of it, and we have put a lot of ideas on the table, which perhaps we can carry through with Brazil and with South Africa, given that this will be a very important time for the global south taking the leadership of G20.
Right. Thanks, Harsh. Let me move on to Brazil. Let me move on to Fabio. You have not taken over yet, but there's a lot of thinking happening. Clearly, I think development resonates, I think, with Brazil as it does with India, as it does with South Africa. What are the sort of emerging priorities, without necessarily just divulging state secrets, but what are the I know there is a policy of not making all the public announcements until you've taken over proper, but what are some of the emerging themes in your various conversations as Brazil prepares to take over?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, the president wrote an article for the University of Toronto, the G20 research group. So it has been launched, this article, and I think that the article anticipates a little bit what the priorities of the G20 Brazil presidency will be. And I think it's pretty clear that there will be some continuity around some of the priorities that we saw in India. Basically, the focus on sustainable development, but a huge focus also on the importance of bringing the voice of the global south to the table, particularly when it refers to the multilateral system and the reforms that the multilateral system needs in order to be representative of the development and the what happened since the Second World War. That would be the first point on the multilateralism. That is a traditional issue that is discussed, particularly in the G20, since the beginning of the group in 2012. I think that the other aspect that would give, I think, that Brazilian flavor to the G20 presidency is actually the fight against inequality, poverty, and hunger. So we know well President Lula first and second term. We know the reform of the welfare system in Brazil. We know the results and the evidence base that has been brought by many research that has been done, and how it became also important for Brazilian foreign policy and for Brazil's South-South cooperation, particularly I would say in Latin America and Africa countries. So I think that we could expect lots of discussion in the G20, but also in different working groups and perhaps a task force dedicated to that. And that I would say that would bring more attention on the needs of financing sustainable development in a broader way. So of course, Brazil supports the whole climate action, but we are really concerned about development being forgotten in this process. So we need to make sure that the ecological transition, not only the energy transition, but the ecological transition comes in a way that it doesn't jeopardize the right to develop that all countries have. So we need to think and we need to discuss around these issues as well. I also would say that Africa and the possibility of African Union coming to the G20 is also will be very welcome by the Brazil presidency. And we need to prepare and need to think. So Lula was quite involved in the first and second term with African countries. He recently went to Africa for the BRICS Summit, of course, but also he went to Angola and later to the meeting of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries in São Tomé and Príncipe. And that was pretty clear. He made at least 2 or 3 speeches where he emphasized the needs of the world, and not only Brazil for historical reasons, for its commitments, but also the world to look at Africa and doesn't forget Africa in this process. So I think that the Brazil presidency will offer the space and the conditions to ensure a greater commitment of the G20 with African countries' priorities. And of course, besides that, the whole discussion around the climate change and sustainable development, that would be clear another priority for Brazil's presidency. So in the G20, we are still getting organized together with our partners, SEBRI and FUNAG, but we also envisage a process that's going to be participatory and open to all think tanks in Brazil. So it will be difficult for Brazil to do something at the scale that has been done in India. But through the G20, we do want to mobilize the academia, but also civil society, and bring to the table these discussions that sometimes look so distant from the normal citizen, but to show to the normal citizen that the decisions that are taken at this level do influence the daily life. So I think that's the message that India was very successful in imparting to its citizens, and that's the G20 at least, and I can speak on behalf of the G20 organizers on that. We'll try to do with this participatory and open way to discuss the issues that are being discussed in the G20.
Fabio, I'm going to ask you the difficult geopolitical question. Harsh has already alluded to both the Bali summit difficulties, as well as some of the challenges that the Indian presidency has had to deal with. President Lula, of course, has been quite vocal on, and Brazil has also made some proposals around the war in Ukraine. How will it become more difficult in what will be, by the time Brazil takes over, the 3rd year of the war, entering the 3rd year of the war? Will it become more difficult to keep the G20 moving forward, at least on some issues? And also in the context of China, US, of course, although there were some positive outcomes from, or some positive rhetoric at least coming out of the latest meeting visit by the Commerce Secretary. But how do you see Brazil sort of navigating that?
Well, we cannot deny that it's going to be difficult, and in part it will depend a little bit on how the G20 Summit in Delhi is going to come out this weekend. But having said that, I do agree with Professor Pantz when he emphasizes that the process perhaps is more important than having the joint declaration. So most of the media buzz is going to go around this, but the process didn't stop, and the process hasn't been jeopardized entirely by the conflict in Europe. I think that the Brazil's diplomacy will have to do lots of work even before we start the G20 presidency in December 1st. And actually the fact that we'll be like heading the UN Security Council in October will be a good opportunity for the Brazilian government and for the Brazilian diplomats to do some work to try to smooth this process throughout the Brazilian presidency. So that's going to be a window of opportunity to try to prevent that some of the discussions do not progress. And basically, I mean, the solution in Indonesia was basically say some members feel. So it was more of a wording process. Now it's going to be to test whether they can repeat it, or if the situation changed that some countries may not accept it anyway. But I mean, but the process is still going, and the discussions and the relevant issues for the world are being discussed and brought to the table. So that's actually the challenge for Brazil, is to keep this discussion going, to have clear priorities for the different working groups and clear deliverables that we can ask the international organizations, the UN system to implement it. And I think that's another message that we need to be clear about it. So the G20 is not an end in itself. The G20 facilitates a process. So when multilateral decisions are taken, it's not at the G20 level, it's at the UN level. So basically that's a way to, let's say, mature some ideas, or to get some energy and speed to move some process. But the G20 is basically facilitating something that needs to go into a broader global multilateral process, including the reform of these multilateral institutions.
Right, thanks. I think that point that you made about the G20 being a facilitator, I think is very important. This is also, I think, certainly the perspective of South Africa, that, you know, the G20 can enable, because you bring together systemically important countries, and if consensus is built there, it's easier to move them into the WTO, into the UN, and so on and so forth. But you know, one shouldn't sort of try to become an alternative. Although I think sometimes the paralysis in some of these institutions does lead you to despair and to think, well, maybe we need to try something different. Let me move on to Matteo Villa. Matteo, Italy will be the incoming chair in 2024 of the G7. You know, Italy is also an active member of the G20 and chaired it, 2 years ago, in fact, in 2021. What is the thinking currently in Italy about how its G7 priorities need to be shaped? Also bearing in mind, I think very importantly, that the lessons we have learned from the last 2 years of the Ukraine war is, and something that I think has shocked Europe and North America, is the way in which the developing countries have positioned themselves, whether non-aligned or sort of a little lukewarm, you know, voting in favor of a resolution, but not implying sanctions, and a sense almost that, you know, in Europe, a sense that Europe has lost the global south. I mean, does that feature in the thinking? And how do we start creating bridges of cooperation?
Yeah, I would say it has, but actually it had for quite some time, right? We just seen I would say, the ultimate consequences of these, first of all, in terms of the Ukraine war's response, which, let's always remember, actually, let's say, had even more economic consequences, global consequences on heavily indebted countries, poorer countries, than in Europe, incredibly. or maybe credibly so, but anyway, unexpectedly so by Europeans, which, you know, we often focus on our own region. We look at our own crisis as if it's in the end our own, and for us to fix, but also for us to face. And in the end, it wasn't, right? So let's say that part of the analysis of the economic impacts, it's clear. I mean, many more countries had crises due to the energy and food crisis originating from the Ukraine war and the price war that ensued than in Europe. Of course, some, you know, economically we might have been more hit, but in the end, it's relative to the income. At the same time, the blaming for the war and the opinions of developing countries has possibly not surprised Europe, but for sure shown that there is a clear difference in views of where the center of gravity of the world, or even the whom to trust, let's say, in terms of whether you would trust your former colonial power or the, let's say, emerging, of course, let's say, subverting power that, I mean, in the Europeans' view, is clearly to blame, right? And instead, on the other hand, you see there very many differences. But I would say, you know, in the end, the G7 has acknowledged already that the pole of cooperation and also especially decision making and coordination at global governance level has shifted, right? So for many years now, the G7 has been inviting other countries to join and at least participate in the works. It doesn't, of course, mean that the G7 then includes these countries in negotiations, but in the end, you know, the G7 today, for instance, this year under Japan's leadership, it was in the end a G15, right? With Indonesia, former G20 chair, the current G20 chair, India, and then Brazil, and then others. So we do look at the global south, and I do expect that the Italian presidency will continue to do so, and will continue to engage. So coordination, that's of course one interesting thing. So the G7 will continue to look at the global south. And on the other hand, we also see a different trend, right? So, other global south institutions enlarging themselves, like the BRICS Summit. And so in the end, there is, I would say, more room both for confusion and for cooperation. Where this leads us, it's really difficult to say just in terms of the institutions. So I would move to Italy's priorities, because yes, I can confirm ISPI as a think tank has been charged to co-chair actually the works of our Think 7. But in the end, it's, you know, as more part of the whole of the G7, which this year and the next does face a lot of challenges in order to at least achieve a part of its priorities, let's say in terms of global governance. Because if you look at what Prime Minister Meloni of Italy has already said, we will have 5 priorities. They may change, but they are already 5. And they are very obvious at first. The first one is support to Ukraine. And you can see it's already frictions with, for instance, the G20. In here, we certainly cannot cooperate. In the G20, we have very split allegiances, or just neutral countries that do not want to take sides on the issue, while the G7 will continue to clearly discuss. I would expect some fragmentation to emerge even within G7 countries, but still, support for Ukraine is the first priority listed by Meloni. So that's let's say more G7 specific. Then we have economic security and energy security. The two things are, I would say, under the G7, they are interpreted in a pretty regional lens, right? So we are out of the woods, possibly, of the energy crisis, but not completely. We want to have a look into that, and also economic coordination in times of inevitably high interest rates in the Western world. But then Meloni has listed a few priorities that, I mean, they are below in the list, but I think they, given that they made the cut, they show how the Italian government is looking at the, at the picture abroad and trying to set the agenda. One of them is migration, which very, very seldom features in G7 meetings, and almost never, I think it never featured in the G20 communique, apart from sometimes very broad, meaning like, we need to govern migration together, and it can be a win-win situation. So migration will feature within the priorities. And finally, two were set together, and attention to Africa specifically, and food security. And within Africa, if I can add one thing about priorities for Italy, I would say the challenge here from hearing officials and ministers is to try to revive any initiative on renegotiating debt or alleviating debt burden on heavily indebted countries. You know that at the G20 level, there was the so-called GSSI initiative. It did have some effects. It did have some effects mostly during the pandemic. It was pretty small by, let's say, alleviation standards. And I would say Italy is patently aware that any initiative at the G7 level. So let's say, I think you're all aware of the Paris Club, right? The Paris Club of important creditors from the West. Let's say that initiative, if it only sticks to Paris Club members, it is bound to fail, because there is another fracture and there is another emerging trend that we now know, right? That China actually holds most of the debt of heavily indebted countries. It's like 2/3 of the debt is Chinese, almost 1/3 is Paris Club, and then there is multilateral institutions. So any negotiation tends to be held back by the fact that there is this big elephant in the room, and at the same time that China is very wary of renegotiating debt currently. So not so easy to do. And again, one of the most important priorities, I would say, for Africa, if you look at the current trend of heavily indebted countries, almost 1/5 of government revenues is today in 2023 going to pay for interest on previous debt, which is, I mean, you are not, no, sorry, and part of the principle, of course, but it's clearly unsustainable for some countries. And most of them, even though we haven't seen failures or coming from that region, but mostly from South Asia currently, we see many more coming up from Sub-Saharan Africa. And so it will be, or even North Africa, for instance, Egypt is in a very dire situation for a country of 100 million people. So we know about that. Given that the Italian government links this also to migration, it will feature prominently in our agenda. Let me just spend a few words on challenges, if I may, Elizabeth. Sorry, I'm talking too much. So on these priorities, I think we have three challenges. Of course, one of is the global context, and we know that it's really, really hard to negotiate today in a, I would say, let's say, well-managed spirit instead of contentious spirit. We know that, and so that's not going to change. Second thing is the one that I mentioned before, the reconfiguration of global governance. Where are decisions going to be taken? Will the G20 continue to be relevant, or will the BRICS Summit try to take over some of those decisions? I don't expect that to happen tomorrow, but that's an interesting trend. But also something that really distracts Europe and the US next year is that we have European elections coming up in June and US elections coming up in December. And just let me highlight this. The G7 Summit is going to be held in mid-June. The European Union, so every 27 member states of the European Union will have voted on 9 or 10 June, just a few days before. We will be knowing the results of the elections. And on, I think, 11 June, something like that, the Republican presidential primaries will have ended and the US election will actually kick off in fall. So, of course, this distracts from important global governance priorities and global public goods priorities. And this will be, I would say, a challenge for any government, and one that Italy, I think, is going to be very well aware of and trying to make officials be aware of this process while they continue to focus on domestic electoral calendars. That is it. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Martin. I wanted to pick up on a couple of points you made. Obviously, the issue of debt and migration can be highly contested issues, because the European Union certainly takes a particular position on migration. It's a very sore point with Africa. And certainly some of the initiatives that the EU is coming up with in terms of payment transfers to Tunisia and things like that is certainly not seen necessarily as the way to go, maybe for the recipient countries. And certainly we also see what's happening with Rwanda in that regard. I mean, that's the one point. The other point on debt, of course, is you're talking about public debt, but there's another dimension of debt, which is, if you look at the overall debt picture, of course, 1/3 is taken up by private creditors. Many of them, of course, unwilling, as one can imagine, to take any haircuts or to be part of the common framework, which is voluntary. But where I think, if we're rethinking some of the rules of global governance and the frameworks, we probably need to think about the kinds of regulations that need to be in place, particularly in the context of climate and the significant investments that need to go into climate adaptation and mitigation. Private creditors, when we're saying at the same time that we need to bring in more private money, that private creditors should not be the ones who are not affected in any way by any of this. And so I think for the G7, I think consideration, in the same way that I would argue about some of the debates around illicit financial flows, about how we create frameworks that enable in a way that doesn't, of course, affect pensioners, because a lot of these private sector creditors are also holding pensioners' investments, but in a way that, it's not just the public purse that is impacted, but also the private sector. But I don't know if you want to do a quick response there, because I want to then have one round of last questions and then go to the audience.
Yeah, no. So very, very quickly on these, I totally second your points, and you're an expert on this. So I will just refrain from making other comments. It's true that private creditors, they should be, held. When a haircut needs to be done and there's public interest in doing that, I know there should be rules, though, so that in the end, there are no holdouts that can really impair the sustainability of the debt going forward if the public then takes a haircut. On what you mentioned, just let me add on the climate finance part. It's also true that will be another issue next year, because for sure G7 countries are pretty happy that they reached, in some accountability, accountability, double counting sometimes, the $100 billion of commitments that they set themselves to almost a decade ago, every year, in order to finance the global transition in developing countries, green transition in developing countries. It's also true that we know it's fatally not enough. We need $1.7 trillion each year, going forward $2 trillion each year, all over the world, and part of that, at least half of that, is developing countries. So that's not enough. We know about that. I don't think that next year will be really the time in which Italy can really, make an effort to raise that sum more. But yes, it's an issue, and it's a problem going forward. We're not looking that much into that, and that must be noted. And following migration, I see your point totally. We know that in the end, migration is also actually a solution for development of some of the countries that are, it can be a challenge even for origin countries. We know that can lead to brain drain and so on. But as long as when you migrate to Europe and you bring back to your country, let's say 100 euros every month, that's enough for another 2 people in your country. Then that's not going to change, and it's going to be a developmental solution. So yeah, we know that the problem for us, of course, for Europe, is that it's irregular migration. But if you do not open up regular channels, you will always have this kind of irregular migration going forward. It's not the G7 clearly the place where to debate that. And yeah, I think there will be really a sole point with African countries this year and the next, with migration increasing actually to Italy especially, and to Europe, irregular migration increasing. So again, Europe looking at Africa for very short-term solutions, while African countries will look at Europe for, you know, developments and solutions that do not force everyone to stay put.
I want to ask a question to all of you, related really to climate, because I think that's one of the the big elephants in the room of global challenges, and there are obviously many, but I think it's one of the biggest. I mean, there was the climate ministers, the G20 climate ministers meeting a few weeks ago. There was an outcome document and chair statement. There was a lot of coverage in the press about the failure to agree on a phase down of unabated fossil fuels. And there was also a failure to really agree on a voluntary pledge to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. There was also a lot of unhappiness, understandably, I think, Matteo, on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the European carbon border adjustment mechanism. But I mean, I think there was also a sense, you know, among many in the G20 that, you know, a fair degree of ambition in terms of some of the things that were on the table. There was disagreement, but a fair degree of ambition, and maybe a number of important countries are really on the same page. But what do you think that might mean for the climate agenda, both in the COP processes, which are where, you know, all of these things are finally agreed, but also in the G20 in the ensuing years? How might we be able to navigate some of the issues that developing countries want on the agenda, but also recognizing that not all developing countries want the same things on the agenda? You know, if we think of Saudi Arabia versus Brazil versus South Africa, different energy mixes, different export of fossil fuels and so on. Let me just put it out there and let me hear your respective comments. Let's start with you, Harsh.
So Elizabeth, I think on climate and climate transition and energy transitions, I think we are beginning to see a more granular debate, because in the past the debate was primarily that here are these two entities, the developed and the developing, and therefore they have to somehow reconcile the differences. I think we are now realizing that it's more complicated. As you mentioned, the energy mix, the energy transitions, the issues of financing that individual developing countries are looking at are also through very different lenses. And I think the point that Fabio made earlier about the fact that ecological and energy transition has to be linked to the right to development, right? So this question ultimately pinning down on this issue of what is the best mix here. I feel that somewhere now, as we move to a phase where the developed world itself is the whole climate carbon tax issue, initiative, etc., looks at its own internal priorities differently. And as the developing world comes to terms with its own differences, I think we are entering into a very interesting phase of this conversation, which may not yield dramatic results very soon. I think we are going to be in this phase for quite some time, because we have to reconcile some of these seemingly irreconcilable differences, both within groupings, within various frameworks, but also the larger philosophical questions it is generating now. I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that there is a new sense in the developed world about their own industrial policy, right? How do you more muscular industrial development policies are being put into place? There is a sense that perhaps the certain members of the developed world are missing the bus if they don't do that. There is a recalibration going on, particularly with regard to China, and I think this is going to completely change the conversation. And I don't think we can there was a time when there was a lot of optimism that look, climate perhaps is this this issue on which everyone will come together philosophically. I think you increasingly, you'll have, when we are looking at the geopoliticization of every aspect of international conversation, I think climate is going to come right there, because how can you define what is happening between the West and China at the moment, if not through the lens of what these two entities, or how these two entities are relating in a post-pandemic world. Pandemic perhaps not the right marker, but essentially the sense that we need to recalibrate our economic relationship. You may call it decoupling, de-risking, you may call it inward orientation, you may call it muscular industrial policies in the West, but something is going on. And I think that change will be reflected in the way the developed world pursues its objectives. And there'll be a pushback from a large part of the developing world, which still feels that they have not been able to, they are being asked to do too much without actually getting the finances, without actually getting the institutional support, without actually getting even the larger political support that is needed. So we are seeing the developed world moving from one goalpost to the other, and the developing world still trying to figure out the original goalpost. So I think it's going to be a very challenging phase, perhaps over the next few years, unless we come to some sort of an equilibrium in this conversation, which I think is, as you mentioned, in this track that we saw this year in G20, it was quite visible that different countries were passionate about their own different frameworks, and they are not at times easily reconcilable. So where do you go from there?
Great, thanks, Harsh. Fabio?
Yeah, I fully agree with Harsh. It's going to be very difficult, and it's gonna take time, because the heterogeneity is within and between in that case. But also what I would like to highlight here is that we keep forgetting the SDGs, and we keep forgetting the different instruments to tackle this issue. So most of the focus has been on the financing side and the energy transition only. And then we add just the to feel good about it. But you also forget the cooperation and the technical cooperation around it, and the need to transfer technology to countries, and the need for the countries to develop and have its own manufacturing sector, for example, that needs to be built in a new, with new energy source, based in renewable energy. So if you don't have a global support for this change, it's going to be very difficult to have a collective action for climate change in the same direction. We also need to acknowledge that countries may have different options, and they may try different things, and science is progressing and trying different options. Some may be more cost effective than others, even when you take into account the environmental impacts. And also there is another dimension that you also should look at, because it's not only climate, it's also the environment. So the impact on biodiversity may differ from the impact on climate. And that's another commitment that countries have made. So I think that the overall picture is challenging, and we do need to factor in all these aspects, from the geopolitics that Harsh has emphasized, but also to the other commitments that we have, and that sometimes we forget, because the power nations are giving the full priority just to the climate action and forgetting the other commitments.
No, I think those are very important points, Fabio. Matteo, and then I'm going to ask you one last question and then turn it over to the audience. If the audience has questions, they can post them in the Q&A. Matteo.
Yeah. Let me just mention, because you mentioned from the Western perspective and the European perspective, especially the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this CBAM. So what it is in the end, in essence, it's a way to punish those countries that do not have a carbon market, right? Do not price in the price of emissions. And in the end, you cannot call it let's say a tariff, but it's a tariff, right? You impose a tax at the border. And clearly that's always been a sore point for European industrialists who think that this leads to the deindustrialization of Europe, because it's the carbon market in Europe, it's more of a cost for European energy intensive industries, and at the same time it answers to the problems of carbon leakage. So it should go and fix, and go towards a public good, common, actually, global public good, but it is interpreted differently from, in every country. It's clearly then a sore point. Again, that is going to come up this year and the next and so on, as Europe moves towards this kind of, as Professor Pantas called it, let's say muscular, but not just industrial policy, right? But also this kind of protectionist policy, even regardless of the fact that in this case, it does work towards pricing in any good that's sold in Europe its own carbon emissions. So that's again, global public good achieved for a tariff, and clearly it will let's say it will. I mean, it is this whole point in negotiations with international other countries, and so for this is just to remark the point that it's true that we look at the same global challenge through a lens of the cooperation, but also competition. And finally, let me also remark the fact that we totally know this. Again, the protectionist Europe, maybe not, industrialist Europe, but the protectionist Europe is now working towards a way to effectively restrict economic forces, of course, subsidized economic forces in the battery, for instance, or wind and solar energy markets against China, especially, right? Because we see, at least we think that it's time to act, given the fact that we've seen that when an oligopoly like Russia does have its hands in the market, it is very efficient, it brings down costs, but then it also gives the opportunity, at least in the short term, to corner the market. So again, these two forces are rebalancing within Europe, and the protectionist ones are rising. And this clearly is interpreted politically and correctly, I would say, as a bad sign from other countries, India including, China for sure. And this clearly doesn't lead to better cooperation, even though, again, I would argue, at least in terms of the CBAM, Europe does have a reason to impose it. On the other hand, maybe it doesn't that much on the wind and solar panels and batteries. It depends on how we frame the issue and how we act. And again, our partners, our competitors, our rivals are going to look at that and see, and perceive themselves as seen as rivals and maybe not as partners. And surely this, as Professor Pant was saying, does show that even climate change is clearly one dimension of international competition together with cooperation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matteo. Of course, it would have been different if CBAM income went to a fund to help developing countries become more competitive. But you've said why, actually. I want to ask one last question, which was also a question that was posed by somebody in the audience, but it was my last question as well, which is, so we've been talking about the G20 for the last hour. What would happen if there was no G20? Does it matter? There's the controversial question. Let me start with you, Harsh. 30 seconds, quickly, so we can then also get a couple of questions from the audience. I see there are 2 questions in the chat. Harsh.
I will be very honest, Elizabeth, if India did not have the presidency, I would not be spending my time learning about G20. I think, the only reason I have invested my time and energy is because I think, India is investing its time and energy in the G20. Indian policymakers are doing that. And I think, the fact that India is speaking so much about G20, and also a lot of the world leaders, for example, suddenly were talking about G20. If you look at the year, a number of these, top leaders were anticipating that, look, we are looking forward to G20. We perhaps see, what India does with it. I think in some ways is a reflection of the times that we live in. That, their other platforms are so defunct that even a defunct platform like G20 is now being made into something which the last few years we would not have been reconciled itself to. So I do think that the energy that India has invested in it. Of course, India invested in it, as I said earlier, because India wanted to showcase to the world that it is also willing to lead on global governance issues. It is also increasingly capable of leading on global governance issues. But I think the fact that G20 became more, more of a symbol about the present status in international relations, I think that is, in some ways, underscores that unless the multilateral institutional framework is working and working in some ways for others. And I think you raised this point earlier, whether we need to, and many others have that, is minilateralism the answer? Are smaller groups the answer? Shouldn't we all be looking at these as a part of the process towards broader multilateralism? I think that's always true, that we look at these platforms as moving towards a larger multilateral goal where all stakeholders can work together. But I think today the divisions are so stark that Matteo was talking about whether BRICS can manage some things here. I think even BRICS what has BRICS achieved apart from NDB and then the New Development Bank? But suddenly now there is 40 odd members want to join BRICS. I think the fact that you have 40 applications coming for BRICS membership is also a reflection that that perhaps the other side, the other actors, the other stakeholders in global governance are not doing their job properly. That there is so much despondency about the larger global order and global multilateral order that platforms like BRICS and G20 are now seen as more than the sum of their parts. So I would say that this reflects more on the present global order than perhaps it reflects on the potency of these platforms.
Thanks, Harsh. Fabio? And I know there have been a couple of questions in the chat which you've actually responded to, so people can also look at those responses. Yeah, Fabio, very quickly.
Difficult to say. At the moment, I think it's necessary. But it's important also to look back to the past. I mean, the importance of the G20 has grown a lot when it became a forum for the head of states, and not only the meeting of the Minister of Finance and the head of the central banks in order to improve financial stability and macroeconomic coordination. That was the very origin. And people still say it's the most important economic global forum. It's not true anymore. It's a developmental forum now. And then what we are asking to the finance track is actually how you ensure development and sustainable development. So the nature, in my view, has changed. And as long as sustainable development is still something that we need to pursue collectively as one planet, to quote the Indian slogan, I think it will be relevant. But of course, it's minilateralism, and you need to move the solutions or the compromise that reached within the G20 to the multilateral institutions.
Great, thanks. Matteo, again, if you can be brief.
Yeah,
Thanks.
no, just to say, yeah, I mean, of course, skepticism has always abounded, especially in specialists like us who watch international governance being in the end a byproduct of, and allowed by forces that are political, or sometimes a necessity given something that's too big not to tackle, like for instance, an economic recession in 2009, but global economic recession. But the truth for me is the world maybe wouldn't change, but having another forum where 20 big leaders can meet, irrespective of any issue, it's, to me, important if you can really bring the 20 together. So it does make sense in terms of how we talk about and intend and perceive cooperation at a global level. One meeting more is always better than one meeting less, especially when it's everyone together, because even just the sense of being together in the same room is really invaluable. I think the pandemic has shown us that it's very hard to negotiate during at a time in which leaders do not meet in person and frequently. So I don't know, at least the frequency of these even useless meetings. To me, it does have value in itself, even though it's true, it doesn't bring anywhere. It doesn't move forward at the agendas and the issues.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to point them to specific people. The one question is from Lerato Tsebe, and this is for you, Harsh. What does the absence of China and Russia mean ahead of the G20? When you say Global South is the anchor of the Indian presidency, what explicitly does India want to achieve with this meeting? I think you alluded to some of the process issues, but perhaps you can sort of elaborate a little bit briefly on that. And then perhaps Fabio, Matteo, well, it's a question really maybe more to Fabio. How do we mainstream biodiversity and climate risk into our policies in Africa, Global South? We've seen or seeing the impact of deforestation, free regulations on trade. And this is Jane Maloney, and she adds to expand on how do you counter climate risk related regulations of the Green Deal? I don't know if you're talking specifically here about the European Green Deal, or more broadly, but Fabio, perhaps your comments, and Matteo, if you also have some brief observations, you're also welcome to make them. Fabio.
Going to the biodiversity question, I think that's actually an internal question. I think the country needs to regulate it internally. I mean, we have set the common goals, and these common goals need to be internalized. And that needs to be reflected in all policies, including the trade policy and the industrial policy as well. So what needs to be done, I think in Brazil, for example, we are now investing a lot on the bioeconomy to preserve the forest, and that's our bet. That's the best way to control deforestation, of course, with enforcement of law that the previous governments completely forgot or went the other way. But I think that depending also on the biome that you have, you need to find the policy and also look at the finance that is available for that. Not going to the carbon markets discussion, but there are other alternatives in order to keep biodiversity and ensuring that infrastructure investment does not devastate it.
Right. Thanks. Do you want to talk a little bit about climate-related risk of the European Green Deal? Maybe Matteo briefly, and then I'll pass on to Harsh for the difficult question.
Yeah, no, just at the point. I mean, I don't expect the G20 to be such a relevant forum for this. It's clearly going to be, let's say, some side events at the COP28 and then moving forward. But it's really a national, it's still so fragmented and national, right? So climate risk, we see it in Europe as well. We can even quantify risk pretty well in terms of billions of euros already due to climate change, tens of billions actually each year. It's still not so high that, at least in its estimates, that policymakers are really paying attention. We're moving from one disaster to the other, and then just treating that as not as a systemic crisis. It actually has not materialized as a systemic crisis. But we know that the poorest countries that do not have the financing to prepare are also the ones that risk be more affected. And of course, this will be a topic moving forward, but it's not for now a global governance topic. So again, important to talk about it, maybe not in this context. At least we're not prepared. There is not even a forum for this to be tackled at the international level. That would bring, I would say, financial results, which is what matters.
Thanks. Harsh?
The absence of the Russian leader and the Chinese leader, I think, is a reflection of the times, again, that we live in. A year back, perhaps there was greater optimism. Today, that optimism, the Russia-West contestation and China and the West contestation is quite explicit. So again, for a platform like G20 that was created largely for economic and geoeconomic issues, we are seeing how geopolitics is becoming the dominant frame of reference. And here, of course, in India, the big point of debate is also that whether it also reflects the absence of the Chinese leader in particular, reflects on the state of affairs between China and India. So that is also, I think, one of the points that that is prevalent in the discussion. But I would say that, look, that's the kind of a global order we are looking at today, that you have, China and Russia's relationship increasingly becoming more potent. And therefore their absence underscores that a global balance of power is moving in a certain direction, and it is having an impact, or it will continue to have an impact on the kind of global governance issues and the global governance questions we ask and the kind of solutions we strive for. So I think we need to be prepared for it. And India, I think, also has, there is a lot of evidence that throughout the G20 process last year, China had been particularly obstructionist on a number of issues, on at times also nitpicking, which Indians felt, or many other leaders or many other stakeholders felt. So I think it is also something that we will see being played out, especially in the bilaterally between India and China, but also largely West and China and Russia and the West as well. Now, when it comes to the global South, I think the reason I think that's a broad frame of reference was because I think the aim has been to look at every single issue through that lens. That whether it is climate mitigation, whether it is sustainable development, or whether it is digital public infrastructure or digital economy, I think the issues that how you frame it, if you frame it around global South or the developing world, you get certain traction, because it was also, I think, in some ways a pragmatic desire on the part of India that, look, if we frame it around global South, if we frame the agenda around global South, it would be easier to convince countries or major stakeholders to negotiate in good faith. After all, why would a Russia or a China or even the West and the US or European Union not take up the cause of the global South? It becomes easier to persuade stakeholders if you are framing it around the global South agenda. So I think the idea that it has to be anchored in the global South narrative had to do a lot with the sense that India had, that if you have to have global conversations today, you need to bring global South at the center, but also a sense of pragmatism about the negotiations that were happening. And of course, that is being reflected, for example, in the push for the entry of the African Union into the G20. So I think broadly, the agenda and the specifics of the agenda were, the framing of that was done to ensure that geopolitics does not become the dominant frame, and to ensure that, at least as far as India was concerned, it could credibly lead a platform where the voice of some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries was missing for a very long time.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panelists joining us from India, from Italy, from Brazil. We really appreciate the time. I know this is a public holiday in Brazil, so thank you for taking up your morning with us, Fabio. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Matteo. And also, very importantly, thank you to our online audience and to the good questions that were posed. My final remarks will be really in response to the one question that Paddy Knudsen has put in the chat, which is, about the global South. Is it time to move away from that narrative? Well, the global South clearly is very differentiated. It's not the global South of maybe 40 or 50 years ago. As rising emerging powers have grown, their interests and their priorities are very different, perhaps from countries that are still low-income countries and so on. But I think at a political level, I think it still has resonance. I think the points that you made, Harsh, in that regard. But I think it is useful, Paddy, to reflect a little bit on how we, in this new world, in this new era, how we begin to reshape the concepts that define the world, and that where we characterize particular groupings and so on. So thank you for that observation. Again, a very big thank you to our panelists, and thank you all. And let's look out to see what happens. Good luck with the Delhi Summit over the weekend, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
See you soon. Bye-bye.